As part of the University of Washington, we acknowledge the Coast Salish people of this land, the land which touches the shared waters of all tribes and bands within the Suquamish, Tulalip, and Muckleshoot nations. Today will be the second in our three-part series featuring talks from the participants of the Winter Data Science Incubator program at the eScience Institute. As a reminder, the Data Science Incubator that we talked about last week is a 10-week intensive program supported by the eScience Institute that pairs a data scientist from eScience with a student, a postdoc, staff, or faculty member on campus to tackle a data science challenge in arts, engineering, humanities, and science. As a reminder, also, we will be using the Q&A feature of the webinar. Remember that Q&A button. Please put all your nice questions in there, and we will address them at the end of each talk. You can find the button there, as I said. And today we're gonna have two graduate students that participated in the Winter Incubator program. We will start our talk with Wei-Yi Cheng. Wei-Yi is a graduate student in the Atmospheric Sciences department, where he works on mechanisms of convective clustering and differential land-sea behavior in global climate models in the group of Daehyun Kim. His incubator project is entitled Dry Thunderstorm Forecast using machine learning techniques. And then we will follow with Jennifer Hsiao. But before that, we will be very happy to hear from Wei-Yi, and we will ask you to put your questions for Wei-Yi at the end of his talk. He's going to address the questions then, and then Jennifer will talk, and we will address her questions after her talk. So please, Wei-Yi, I'm very eager to hear about your work during the incubator.
Yeah, thank you, Nicoletta, for the nice intro. Hi, I'm happy to be here today. In today's talk, I will talk about the dry thunderstorm forecast model using machine learning methods. This is a collaborative work done by me and my advisor, Daehyun Kim, and Atmospheric Science Department, and Robert Halsworth at Earth and Space Science Department, and Scott Henderson at eScience Department. First, I want to thank the incubator program for giving this opportunity to work together, and I have been having a great time here. So first, let me talk about the impacts of lightning and why this is an important issue that we should all care about. So lightning poses a serious threat to public safety, including causes of deadly damages and also a major source of wildfires. On average, there's approximately 24,000 people died every year due to lightning-induced hazard worldwide. And there are approximately 22,000 lightning-induced fire per year in the US alone, and also more than 1 billion lightning-induced damages per year, also in the US alone. So among all types of thunderstorm, there's one type of thunderstorm that is particularly dangerous in terms of the risk of the wildfires, and it is called the dry thunderstorm. Generally speaking, dry thunderstorm are the type of thunderstorm that are accompanied with very little precipitation, and they're dangerous for the spread of wildfire for two reasons. One, obviously, there would be no rain to stop the fire from initiating. And second, because this usually means that the atmosphere is dry, so rainfall will evaporate very quickly, and which will cool the atmosphere and will make the air colder and denser than the environment. So when the air falls to the surface, the temperature difference will lead to a strong gust wind near the surface, and that will further spread out the fire once there is one. So here on the left shows the frequencies of US wildfires, and on the right shows the dry thunderstorm fraction, which means that whenever there's a thunderstorm, what are the chances that they're accompanied with precipitation less than 0.5 millimeter per hour. So the figure shows that there's a pretty good correlation between wildfire events and dry thunderstorm events. So given the importance of lightning and thunderstorm, it's critically important for the Earth system model to have an accurate representations of lightning, so that we can have a good handle on the thunderstorm forecast. The lightning representation in Earth system model apparently depends on what we know about the lightning mechanism and how it's initiated. So physically, what really causes the lightning. So let's start from how thunderstorms become electrified. So given a thunderstorm like this, the electrification process down here within the convective clouds above the freezing level. In this region, the cloud particles are often composed of different types of hydrometeors, including graupel, which is a larger ice particle, and also small ice crystal. So when these two types of ice particle collides, the positive charge will be transferred from one to the other, usually transferred from the graupel particle to the ice crystal. So after the collision, the graupel will carry a net negative charge and the ice crystal will carry a net positive charge. So next, because within the convective clouds, there often exists a very strong updraft. So this updraft will bring the lighter ice particle upwards and let the heavier graupel particle flows downwards. So this is the key process that will separate the charge within the clouds. So over time, positive charge will accumulate at the top and negative charge will accumulate near the bottom. So when the electric field here becomes strong enough, the lightning strikes become possible. And yeah, either from cloud to cloud or from cloud to ground. So that's basically how we get lightning strikes. So to summarize, there are at least two key components for us to have lightning. So one, we need to have ice particle, and the second, we need to have updrafts. So in other words, we need to have a strong, we will end up having a strong precipitation caused by the ice particles. This is very easy to observe, but what's difficult here is that we also need to have the deep and intense convection. So that describes the vertical motions of the atmosphere. And that's something that is very difficult to observe. So to infer the updraft velocity from convections, the atmosphere scientists often use the convective available potential energy. So this is a measure of the maximum energy that can be released during convection. An easy way to understand this quantity is that if the air near the surface is warmer or contains more moisture, the air will be more buoyant. So when convection happens and the air is brought upwards, there will be more energy released and we'll have a faster vertical motions. So Kp is a function of temperature and moisture profiles. And just a reminder that there's a lot of assumption going into the calculations of Kp, but there's do have a physical basis for this quantity. So since precipitation and vertical motions are the two key components for the generations of lightning, we can represent lightning in the atmospheric model based on these two quantities. So for example, Rumps et al. In 2014 proposed the lightning parameterization methods, which they relates the lightning flash rates F proportional to the products of precipitations in Kp. So what they found is that this simple equation works fairly well in terms of representing the lightning climatology over the continental US region on the daily time scale. So this is exciting, but what we cares about is the thunderstorm forecast, right? So can we know if thunderstorms are going to happen 2 days in advance or 1 week in advance? So this is an example of the thunderstorm forecast events, and noted that the lightning here is parameterized using the Rumps et al. Methods. So here shows the thunderstorm events happen on a specific day here. On the top left here shows the observed lightning flash rates, and top right shows the 1-day forecast. So what this means is that we initialize the model with the best initial condition that we have 1 day before these events, and then let the atmospheric model integrate forwards. And we use the forecast temperature and moisture and rainfall to make a prediction for lightning flash rates. And the bottom shows 1 week forecast and 2 week forecast. So not surprisingly, we noticed that the forecast scale decreases over time as lead time increases. And so this is illustrated in this figure here. So the blue line here shows the correlation as a function of forecast day. So we do notice that this is decreasing over time, but you may also be surprised that for some reason, the correlation is still quite high, about 0.8, even in 35 lead times. And that's largely because both lightning and Kp and precipitation have a very strong annual cycle. So what this tells us that it's fairly easy for model to predict the lightning flash rate as long as the model knows what season it is in. So if it is summer, there's more thunderstorm, and winter, there's less thunderstorm, and that's not too hard for model to guess. So what's more important, or what we really cares about is, say, compared to normal July, how many more lightning strikes are we going to get tomorrow? So this is the correlation when we remove the annual cycle. So what this shows here is that after about 2 weeks, the correlation coefficient dropped to pretty close to 0. So this means that if we want to know the number of lightning flashes in 2 weeks in advance, we can basically look at the climatology and guess the number of lightning strikes instead of looking for the weather forecast, because the weather forecast model basically loses skill beyond 2 weeks. And that's not completely due to the poor lightning parameterization. It's important to note that the predictability of thunderstorm is the functions of both atmospheric model and lightning parameterization methods. So the atmospheric model is actually a complicated model, and it's very hard to replace. But we know that the existing lightning parameterization methods are all rather simple, as we see earlier, they're just simple equations. And there are plenty of assumptions going in. There's a lot of room for improvement. So the question here I want to ask is, can we extend the predictability of thunderstorm by utilizing the machine learning based lightning parameterization methods? So the data we use here, we use, so for the atmospheric state variable, we use the GEFS sub-X hindcast datasets. So how this hindcast dataset work is like the diagram shows here. So as the time goes on, the hindcast data, the atmospheric model starts every 7 days. So once it starts, it will make prediction for the next 35 days. And it will repeat this process just like in real life, right? In real life, we have weather forecast model, may forecast in 30 days in advance, but that model will only initiate every 7 days. And the lightning data here we use is the worldwide lightning location network. It's called WLAN. And the periods we're focusing on is the 2010 to 2016. And we only focus on the CONUS domain, which stands for the continental US. And we have the daily data with spatial resolutions of 1 degree by 1 degree. So here we use 2 types of machine learning approach. One is the column-based machine learning approach, where we will train the machine learning model. So this is an example of one training sample. So we have input features that like CAPE, precipitations, and pressure vertical velocity at 500 hectopascal, and surface temperature and 2 meter dew point temperature, all within the same 1 degree by 1 degree box. And the output will be the lightning flash rate over the same grids. So the concept here is that we're mapping the atmospheric profiles to lightning flash rates. This is the same idea as the traditional lightning parameterization methods, where we sort of assume that given the same vertical profiles and atmospheric conditions, they will correspond to the same lightning flash rates. Another types of machine learning method that we propose to use is a image-based lightning parameterization methods, where the inputs, instead of assuming the using the vertical profiles and atmospheric variables, we use images, 2D images. So we're more like to look at the weather maps instead of the vertical profiles. And the unit here is just the architecture to map one map to another map. So the input will be the atmospheric state variable maps, to the output will be the lightning flash rate maps. So the idea here is to mapping the weather pattern to lightning flash rates. And here's a quick example of the results. So on the top left, here's the one example of the predictive forecast events. Here shows the observations of that thunderstorm events. And here shows the operating with this traditional. And here's the 1 day forecast, and this is a 7 day forecast, and this is a 14-day forecast. On the right here shows the CNN, which is image-based methods. So what's apparent here is that we notice that in day 1, the forecast is pretty good. Yeah, that's because the atmospheric models are doing pretty good. But as the time goes on, the patterns start to look different. And for the operating methods, it follows very strictly to the atmospheric model. So it kind of, as the atmospheric model drifting away from the truth, it will have a very wrong prediction of the thunderstorm. And still the methods, because it's trends every lead time. So we're separating the training for every lead time. So at the lead time equals to 14, the CNN model sort of knows that the model generally does a fairly poor job. So instead of predicting the very deterministic thunderstorm events, it generally predicts like a a map, like a climatology of thunderstorm events. And here shows the top left still shows the observation, but here the 2 column here shows the 2 different column-based approach. Here shows the random forest, and this is a neural network. So again, this type of the random forest model still follows very closely to the MS3 model, but the neural network model sort of knows that as a lead time increases, the MS3 models are doing something not very close to the observed events. So it's generating more like a broad and a vague ideas of where the thunderstorms are going to be. So here's the results, key results that we wanted to show. So the blue line here shows the operating method, which is traditional lightning parameterization methods, and the red line shows the machine learning results. And here shows the random forest, and this neural network model, and the CNN results. And the solid line shows the total, and the dashed line shows the one we removed the monthly mean average. So the key takeaway here is that all 3 machine learning methods improve the performance, improve the forecast skill at all lead times, especially for the solid line, which shows that what this really means is that the machine learning model have a better predictability for the climatology of the thunderstorm events. But also, if you look at the dashed line, they also improve the forecast scale before the 14 days threshold, but also after the 14-day thresholds. And here, what we really want to look at is here's the send images before we were separating that to different seasons. So this is from January to December. And the color here still shows the correlation coefficients. So we do see that in the R14 method, there's a strong seasonality where the model performs better in the winter season and perform worse in the summer season. And if we look at, this is the random forest model, neural network model, and CNN methods. And here shows and the very bottom shows the difference. So the red here means that the machine learning models performs better than the R14 methods. So we do see that over summer season, all 3 machine learning models are performing better than the traditional methods. But for the winter season, the machine learning models are performing worse. And the possible explanation here is that there's more thunderstorm in the warm season, so that we have in the training data, we have more training data in the warm season, so the training is skewed toward the warm season. So they can perform better in the warm season, but not so much in the winter season. So go back to our question, what about the dry thunderstorm? So it turns out that the random forest model in the neural network, the column-based approach can really improve the dry thunderstorm forecast. But for the CNN methods, it turns out that at least in the day 1 to day 3 forecast, the CNN methods seems to have a worse performance. We're still looking into why that's the case and if there's any limitation to the CNN methods for these dry thunderstorm events. But we don't have an answer for that yet. So here's a quick summary. So different lightning parameterization methods are tested and evaluated using the GFS hindcast data sets. And our results shows that the machine learning based lightning parameterization methods improves the forecast scale at all lead time. And one important note here is that machine learning methods performs better in the warm season, but worse in the cold seasons, which is likely due to the different training sample size. And this is important because most of the lightning-induced hazards happens in the warm season. So if we can really improve our forecast scale in the warm season, that can be very helpful. So here's some of the future work. First, we want to look at the regional differences, particularly looking into the topography and aerosols effects. And we do notice that there's some regional differences, right? Because like we know that, for example, CNN methods do perform better in general, but it has a worse performance in the southwest of the US. So we want to look into why that's the case, and if that's caused by the topography or aerosol, and if we can include those information in our training data, that can improve the performance there. And as we want to look at the feature importance for the normal thunderstorm and also the dry thunderstorm to look at what's the missing in the physical model that's important but not represented. And also we wanted to try out some recurrent neural network methods because the lightning flash rates, we can also treat it as a time sequence, and whether using the recurrence neural network can improve the performance of the predictability of thunderstorms. I think that's it. Any questions?
Thank you very much, Wei. That was really great. We do have a couple of questions. The first one is from Hammond. He says, great talk, Wei. In the line plots that you compared your results with ROMPs, what is special about the 14 days that there is a kink in your results there? Can you?
So 14 days usually the limitations of the MRS model. So we do know that the MRS model, well, it's a chaotic model, right? So we are slowly drifting away from the real worlds, and 14 days is sort of like the limits. We know that it is current limitation that it's very hard to make prediction beyond 14 days. And so that's why it's so special about the 14 days. But in terms of the kink, I don't know the answer to that because it does seem somewhat weird that we will have a kink in the plots. But I guess that might be just due to the sample size or some noise there. But generally speaking, we do expect that the model will lose some predictability after 14 days.
Thank you, Wei. We'll take another question, and then I think we're gonna move on to Jennifer's talk. So here's a question from Will. He says, cool work. I'm wondering how your random forest neural network CNN models perform in terms of error, for example, RMSEs, and how that compared to the traditional methods in addition to correlation coefficients that you showed. Thanks.
Yeah, that's a good question. I did try to plot the rooming square errors. I didn't show you today because you will see very similar results, but I chose to use a correlation because you can see that it has a meaningful results, right? Because you know that when the correlation is close to 0, that means you're losing all the predictability or losing all the scale. But in terms of the rooming square error, you will see the number increases, but you wouldn't be able to tell if there's any physical meaning for that number. So that's the reason I chose to plot the correlations, but they will have a very similar results.
Great, thank you so much, Wei.
Thank you.
We wish you luck in your future research. And I think now we're gonna invite Jennifer to start sharing her screen. Thank you. Jennifer is a graduate student in the biology department where she studies how climate change will impact agricultural systems in the group of Abigail Swan in the Department of Atmospheric Sciences and Biology. Her incubator project this year is entitled Climate Adaptation for Future Maize, Novel Plant Traits and New Management. Jennifer, I think you can now start your presentation. Thank you.
Okay, great. Thank you for the introduction, Nicoletta. Hi, everyone. I'm Jennifer Hsiao, and I'm really happy to be able to share some of my work with you all today, thinking about climate adaptation for maize, specifically in the US, and thinking more about how traits and management can be used for adaptation strategies. And before starting, I just wanted to acknowledge my collaborators on this project, Dr. Abby Swan, Dr. Sihong Kim, and Dr. Dennis Timlin. I also wanted to thank Dr. Brenna Hazelton, who was the data science advisor on this project, and who really helped a lot, both on the technical coding side of this project and also helped develop some of the analyses methods that we used. And it was a really great experience being able to collaborate together. Okay. So I wanted to start my talk by sharing this figure that shows the US maize yield dating all the way back to the 1860s up to present day. And one trend that you might notice is that starting from the 1950s, 60s, all the way up to present day today, we actually see a positive yield trend that has been going on for several decades. It's quite impressive. And so a lot of this positive trend is thanks to the continuous effort, both on the breeding side and the continuous improvement in management practices. But one of the big questions that we are facing today is really trying to understand if this positive yield trend will continue on. If so, for how long, would eventually plateau out, or do we even start to expect decreases in these trends due to future climate conditions? So it's quite likely that we will need new cultivars and targeted management practices that are more suited for future climate conditions. And so for my project, kind of this broad overarching question that I was interested in looking at was to understand what would an ideal crop that is adaptive under a changing climate look like. And so just to clarify, when I'm talking about this concept of an ideal crop, I'm thinking about it more in kind of this holistic way that includes not just the genetics of makeup of this crop, but also management options that go well with them, and also to think about under what environmental conditions does it perform best. And so just to dive a little deeper into the background, if one were to go and breed for a new cultivar, what does the process look like? And so in a typical breeding cycle, you as a breeder would typically start working with a large genetic pool of individuals to select from. And this can go up to numbers all the way up to in the order of 100,000 individuals that all have kind of variations in their genetic makeup, variations in different traits. And these individuals will go through really intense selection pressure, and then you would end up with a handful of candidates, promising candidates. And it's not really towards the later stage of this process where you would then start to take a couple of these candidates and you'd start growing them out in actual field sites to see under what environments do they perform best and what management options are best suited for them. And so after a lot of testing, you will eventually end up with a handful of cultivars for commercial release. And a lot of this elite genetic material will then feed back into to create new recombinants, and the whole breeding cycle continues. And so this cycle goes on, and this is largely what contributed to the positive yield trend that I shared earlier. And it's probably not hard to imagine that this is actually a really time and resource intensive process. And because of this, you're inevitably limited in terms of this, the space that you can explore in terms of this genetic and management and environment space. So just some numbers here. From initial breeding cross to commercial release sometimes can take in between 5 to 7 years. If you think about this process in a more long-term, a more complete way, breeding delivery to adoption can sometimes take up to 30 years. So it's a really long process and a lot of pretty resource intensive. On top of that, breeding directions within these breeding programs don't always have climate adaptation in mind. Most of the times, targets are towards yield. Sometimes disease resistance are important too. But it's not always explicitly considered a new cultivar's ability to adapt to new climate conditions. So kind of what we were trying to address with our project is wanting to develop kind of a modeling framework that allowed exploration of ideal crops specifically suited for climate adaptation purposes. And what we wanted to use is to take a mechanistic model that we had the ability to tweak its genetics makeup in terms of altering the plant traits, altering management practices, and in being able to run simulations under different environmental conditions in this modeling setup, both in current climate conditions and future climate, to kind of help with this traditionally pretty resource and time intensive process. So kind of taking a modeling approach to help or as a complementary to actual breeding practices. So with that, some of the key questions we wanted to answer include what are ideal crop traits and management that can maximize yield and minimize risk? What are some ideal traits for different agroclimate regions within the US? And how might ideal traits shift under a changing climate? And just a disclaimer that I probably won't be able to answer all of these questions today. This is still very much an ongoing project. And a lot of the progress we made during the incubator last quarter was kind of on the infrastructure side, getting workflows set up to run many simulations, thinking about different ways to analyze the model outputs, but I will be sharing some preliminary results. Okay, so since we're taking a modeling approach, I wanted to spend a little bit of time to talk about the mechanistic crop simulation model that I use in my work. And this is basically a tool that synthesizes various processes that govern maize growth and yield. And some of the key processes that this model captures include morphological aspects of the crop, phenological aspects, which is basically how the crop moves through different developmental stages throughout the growing season, and also physiological processes of the crop. These are basically the inner workings of the plant, including processes like photosynthesis, respiration, and water relations, etc. So to run this model, you would provide it with environmental data, hourly environmental data, to allow the modeled plant to respond to its surrounding environment. So since the model describes various traits, including morphology, phenology, and physiology, we were able to select a few key parameters that are associated with these different traits, and to artificially perturb and create idealized cultivars. I'm using the term cultivar a little bit loosely here, but basically you can think of them as individuals that have different specific trait combinations. So we chose a few parameters of interest and sampled these parameters using a Latin hypercube sampling approach with biologically meaningful boundaries to create several idealized cultivars. And so here's an example of one of these cultivars. And you can see, like, using this method, we can create various different individuals that all have different characteristics. And so this is kind of like linking back to the analogy of the example of an actual breeding practice, is kind of like setting up our genetic material to work with. We created a bunch of artificial cultivars that have different traits to work with. So with our cultivars or individuals created, the next step was to collect environmental data in order to run the model across many different locations across the US. And so for this, we collected hourly environmental climate data. We collected temperature, humidity, and precipitation data from the NOAA Integrated Surface Hourly Database. We collected our solar radiation data from the National Solar Radiation Database. And so these locations, they have a pretty long record, it's a couple decades, but not all sites have the complete record. So the color here in this map, the darker, just shows that there's more years of data available. And we also collected soil information for each location from the Sergal soil database. Next step was to filter these sites based on cropping area and irrigation level. So we only wanted to include sites that actually had a substantial amount of corn being planted. So here, from this USDA data set, we were able to select to include sites that had corn planted. And we also wanted to include majority rain-fed plants, since corn is mostly rain-fed, and we also wanted to exclude the complication of irrigation in our experiments. So with our weather data ready and our artificially created cultivars ready, we basically were able to run ensemble simulations for each of our site years. There's approximately 2,600 site years. We ran simulations at each of these locations. And the main output that I'll be showing you today is the final yield that the model simulated. Okay. So that was kind of getting the model up and running. So some preliminary results here. This heat map that I'm showing here, the color is showing the yield mean. And what is shown here, here on the y-axis, these are, so each row indicates yield output for a particular cultivar that has a particular trait combination. And here on the x-axis, so basically each column shows results from an individual site. And the sites are roughly organized from south to north. And these cultivars are organized with the highest yielding cultivar on the very top. So some patterns that we see here is that we were able to identify a few high performing cultivars, which are the ones that are clustered on the top here. We also see some spatial variation in how different cultivars performed across different locations. We were able to kind of map this information back to our simulation sites to look at which cultivars led to highest yield at different locations. So we see that here we identified a handful of good performing cultivars, and there seems to be a little bit of a spatial variation in terms of which cultivar performed best where. So even though there is some variation in terms of which cultivar was best where, these are all pretty high performing cultivars compared to some of these lower performing ones down here. So one thing we were really interested in is to understand whether there were some commonalities, what were some key traits that led to this high yield performance. So the next thing that we did was to run a sensitivity analysis to calculate the partial correlation coefficient of each of these parameters of interest. And this is the PCC values are basically what I'm plotting in this bar chart here. So if you get positive PCC values, which are these orange traits here, that basically means that if you have a higher value in those orange traits, you are correlated with higher yield. And this blue trait basically means if you get lower values in this trait, you're correlated with higher yield. So without going into too much detail of the underlying mechanisms of each of these parameters, just very briefly, these orange traits seem to be associated with how long a plant can stay active during a growing season. And this blue trait has some complex, nuanced interactions that governs water relations within the plant. So, sorry, just to jump back. So this is good to know that these are some traits associated with high yield, but yield is not the only thing that we're interested in. In addition to yield, we're also really interested in identifying cultivars that also have lower risk associated with that. And this is what we're defining here kind of as this concept of yield volatility. So we wanted to find cultivars that didn't have a huge year-to-year variation in their yield production. So the scatter plot here is showing the average yield on the x-axis and this yield volatility on the y-axis, and each individual point shows the result for one particular cultivar. There's a total of 100 of them. That's why there's all these numbers associated with each point. And what we really want to get at is to identify these cultivars that kind of fall in this lower right quadrant, which are the ones that give you high yield and lower risk. So there's just a lot more digging in that we need to do to identify what is special about these cultivars that fall under this quadrant, but this is kind of the framework that we'll be using moving forward. So this plot here basically shows an average performance of each cultivar across all locations in our simulation sites. But we were also wondering that maybe there might be some differences between different agroclimate regions. So here are all our sites. This is our rough attempt in trying to categorize our sites into different climate regions. Here is just one attempt by clustering them by how cool or warm their temperature is and how wet and dry the conditions are. And so we can also then basically run the same analysis, but now in a more detailed approach, looking at how these responses varied across different climate space. And so here we can see that the overall picture is similar across sites, but there are some nuanced differences between, say, cooler sites and warmer sites. And also, it seems like on average, the plants are actually performing better. There are more cultivars that fall in this good cultivar quadrant in warmer regions. But this is kind of an initial approach, and just thinking closer about how individual cultivars interact with different background climate conditions is kind of an important setup while thinking about shifting into future climate conditions that could potentially be warmer and drier. So this is kind of an interesting space that we're looking into to dive a little deeper into. So just a quick summary of some of the results that I shared today, really trying to set up this framework that can use models to help explore ideal crops for climate adaptation. The simulations that we've done so far really only explored kind of this genetic space in terms of plant traits and its interaction with current climate environments. I know I included management in the title, but I actually unfortunately didn't have enough time to include some of the simulation results with that. We're very actively trying to put together more simulation experiments that also include exploring this management side and also running similar experiments. But instead of using past climate, we plan to use future climate projections to see how the responses might shift. So with that kind of leads to some future work. One thing we really want to focus on is to take a closer look at the mechanisms behind what led to good performing cultivars. And I think this is one of the benefits of using a process-based modeling approach is it really allows you to dig a little deeper into the processes behind behind the results that you see. So that's definitely an angle that we're going to be focusing on more. And these other 2 points are basically to also include management in the parameter perturbation setup, and also to set up simulations for experiments under projected future climate conditions. And so we really hope that the implications of this work is to provide a more informed navigation of the complex landscape of possibilities associated with crop improvements. So you can imagine the space is kind of like all the possibilities that genetics, management, and environment can potentially lead to good crop performance. But really with a modeling approach, what we're trying to do is to help breeding programs or breeders to more efficiently navigate to this high performance spot. And just at the very end, I just wanted to thank the Incubator program again. I really learned a lot during this past quarter, and a lot of that is probably not shown directly in the presentation today, but a lot of the things that I learned included best practices in coding, modularizing and testing code, learning how to build a SQL database to help store and interact with my simulation data, and also just having the opportunity to brainstorm ideas with a group of really wonderful people. So with that, I wanted to wrap up. Here are some funding sources, and thank you all for your time, and I'm happy to answer questions if there are any.
Well, thank you so much, Jennifer. That was a wonderful presentation. I'm glad you enjoyed the incubator. There's a question from Will. Cool work. What causes yield variance in your models? Number one, that's the number one question. And number two, how did your cultivar modeling account for biological trade-offs among traits?
Okay, yes, great question. So what causes yield variance in the model? A lot of that, so as I showed in the partial correlation coefficient plots, there are some key traits that were associated with high yield. And a lot of the variability was due to basically so a lot of these traits that were related to the development of the plant are temperature related. So basically, under warmer conditions, it seemed like if you're able to eventually reach the right developmental stage that can help you gain yield, that basically leads you to have a higher yield. But during some locations or some years where you have cooler climate, for example, or you have other stressors such as water stress that prevent you from reaching these really critical grain filling periods in your model, you could end up with really low yield. And some cultivar combinations are just more sensitive since we're kind of artificially creating these trait combinations. So some cultivars are just more sensitive in how their different growth periods respond to the climate that could lead to higher variability than others. And there's still a lot more to poke around there, but that's my initial answer. The second part, was it to account for biological trade-offs amongst traits? That's a great question. We currently do not account for that. The way we're sampling the parameters, we assume that all parameters are independent. And as a biologist, I understand that's not always a realistic assumption, but we're sticking to this approach mostly to still set up our parameter space and look at the outputs, and knowingly the caveat that maybe some of these combinations either are not realistic or as you mentioned in this question, that there could be trade-offs that are maybe harder to achieve in reality. So that's kind of the caveat that comes along with this parameter sampling approach. Yeah.
Thank you, Jennifer. We're gonna take one last question from Carly. So interesting to see applications of plant modeling, Jennifer. I was curious about a site in your cultivar south-north yield color plot. Why did one of the sites, 40 or 41, perform so poorly across nearly all cultivars?
Thank you for the question, Carly. Good eye. Yes, I did notice that site. I'm forgetting exactly where it is, but so my guess is probably that there's some data quality issue going on in that particular site that I will need to go back and check more carefully. And even though we did kind of filter to include sites that basically we know have corn plants planted, so it didn't go into too much detail, but there was some, not all of these data sources match each other. And so there was, I'm suspecting that one of these sites are actually further away from where corn plants are actually planted. And maybe the climate is either weird, not really conducive for corn plants, or there's some data quality issues that we definitely need to go and address. Yeah, but good catch.
All right. If there are no more questions, I think we are going to conclude our seminar today. And I would like to invite you next week to continue with our incubator talks. I think that's it for today. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Nicoletta. Thank you, Wei.
Thank you.